Okay, well, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So I'm pleased to introduce Kelsey O'Connor, whom I've had the pleasure to meet recently. Kelsey is a researcher in the economics of well-being at Static Research, the research team at the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. He earned a PhD in economics in 2017 at the University of Southern California, working with Richard Easterlin and Jeffrey Nugent. And his work focuses on the causes and consequences of subjective well-being. The title of his paper is The Effect of Immigration on Natives' Well-Being in Europe. So please join me in welcoming Kelsey.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know after lunch it can be tough with the UVA game on as well. I know conflicting interests. So I'm excited to be here in part because I'm really excited about the institution in general. I went back to school to study happiness. I'm primarily here now to argue with economists about the primacy, not just economists, but the primacy of GDP as a measure of well-being. I think that that was never the intention, and it's become the default, and it's our job to change that. I do have some positive notes, though. So I work at this statistical institution, national statistical institution of yes, it is a small country, but the director of this institute actually recently said GDP is dead in terms of measuring well-being. So of course we're going to continue to do this, but this is a country that's explicitly saying that we need to go beyond. And there are quite a few countries doing this, and I'm just representing one. So they have recently released a report, for example, looking at a dashboard of indicators trying to get at well-being. And so there's a lot going on there, and that's part of the reason why I've gone there. And this just represents an application of what can be done if we think about measuring well-being in a broader sense. So it's going to be different, quite a bit different from what we looked at before, much more of a theoretical point of view. This is very applied. If you have any questions with anything, please feel free to stop me, and we can address it right away. I'm going to make sure that this is all well understood. With that, we'll get started. So I feel like immigration, of course, is a topic that is heavily discussed in the media right now. I am now an immigrant in Luxembourg. So it's, and Luxembourg is an unusual place in that 50% of the total population are immigrants. So this is a particularly relevant topic there. And so you may be familiar with it from an American point of view. So let's look at it in Europe, just kind of an idea of what they're thinking about. So if you look here, this is the response to a survey question. What do you think are the two most important issues facing the EU at the moment? So this is at the end of 2017, and you can see that terrorism and immigration are almost listed at the same level and at more than double the economic situation. So clearly, and this is, I've looked at just the natives here. The natives are really thinking about immigration. So this is not just maybe an EU response, sorry, an American one, but also something going on in the EU substantially. And so my question is, are they right to think that immigration is an issue? And to answer this question, we need reliable evidence on the multidimensional impacts of immigration. So we can think about how immigration might affect natives in multiple ways. So I think probably the one most people think about first is it increases the supply of labor, which is going to reduce the wages of people presently in the market. So you can see what I've highlighted there in red is just a negative, so suggesting that should have a negative impact on the overall outcome. So that's what people focus on first, but it also reduces the cost of production. So that is going to make goods cheaper across the entire economy. And so this may have different impacts. So on wages, it may affect people with lower levels of education, and cost of production may affect the overall economy, affecting the broader group. But it also increases the diversity of the labor force and firms, which I suspect have a positive impact. So this improves allocative efficiency. So you can think of this as filling the positions of natives that natives cannot. For example, we have part of the reason why we have a lot of immigrants in Luxembourg is Portuguese and Italian people were invited in the 70s to fill positions that were they didn't have enough people to fill. They also bring new skills, lead to greater innovation, and they produce new goods and services. Probably one of the most salient things in this regard is maybe just going to a Chinese restaurant or an Italian restaurant or French. So they're bringing new objects to the country. But that also increases social diversity, and this could reduce social cohesion. And with less social cohesion, we might agree on the provision of public goods, maybe to a degree less. So this is perhaps a negative impact. But natives could also just have different preferences for or against diversity. What's the impact on culture? Do we like the impact on culture? So we might think that that's a good thing or a bad thing, or maybe it's good in some cases and not good in others. So one more thing, it increases total population. Right? So your commute to work that could be negatively impacted just by the total number of people there. And that's also your commute on roads is kind of a form of public goods as well. So greater strain on some of those. So the aggregate effect on the general population is unclear in theory. So we need to look at the evidence to have a sense of what's happened in the past. So the past evidence has been primarily focused within economics, but not just economics. It's been primarily focused on economic outcomes such as wages. And the findings are generally mixed and fairly small. In part, that might be because different population groups are being affected. In Europe, they seem to be a little bit larger. Considering the effects on subjective well-being, there have only been 6 papers. And the most closely related paper to what I'm presenting is this one here, Betts and Simpson. They found small positive relation in the EU countries kind of as a whole, but over a relatively short period of time, 2002 to 2010. From additional country studies, they're all done in just individual countries. So just Germany, just the United States, the United Kingdom separately. In the US, the effects were very heterogeneous, and I would say negative, but again, fairly small. So the evidence so far is fairly limited in terms of the country coverage, the time period, as well as the methodology. So what I'm going to do is try to address this question. How has the rise in immigrant shares affected the life satisfaction of natives in Europe? And my contribution is to use a larger sample. I'm going to look at the period 1990 to 2017, and also a large group of countries, which I'll specify shortly. And I'm going to use instrumental variable analysis, and this is a statistical technique that can help me identify causal relationships and not just associations. So the data. So immigrant stocks in a destination country available by country of origin. So I know, the number of people in the United States and where they all came from. And that's available every 5 years from 1990 to 2015 and again in 2017. And really importantly, it excludes refugees. So there's nothing I can do about that. And it's consistent with the past data or papers in literature, but of course what a lot of people are thinking about right now are refugees, not immigrants, although they are relatively small in the overall stocks. And natives' life satisfaction, of course, this is what we're talking about here at this conference, right? Is how do we measure this? So this is a pretty standard measure, but has some limitations. So it's a response to this question. On the whole, are you very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very satisfied, or not at all satisfied with the life that you lead? So this is a cognitive evaluation of how you feel about your life, right? So importantly, it is distinct from just an emotional evaluation about how you feel presently. It's about how you think on the whole. It's very easy for people to understand, but of course it is a single dimension. And there are only 4 categories in the response. So this is micro-level data, so I have it for each individual, but there are some challenges with looking at it over the entire time period. So what I've done is I've actually aggregated it to the country level by looking at the proportion of people that responded in the top 2 categories. So it's the people that responded very satisfied or fairly satisfied. So essentially more satisfied than not. and that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm constrained to the EU member states of the time. So as you know, some member states joined later on in the 2000s, and some were present in the 90s. So to give you a sense of the data and what this looks like, across the bottom you have the immigrant share, and on the left you have the proportion of people saying that they're more happy than not. And you can see Luxembourg far out there on the right with a very high proportion of immigrants, but also relatively happy. Across the bottom, you've got Bulgaria and Greece reporting pretty low levels of life satisfaction. Greece is probably pretty intuitive. Bulgaria is also having some difficulty transitioning. So, but in general, what you can see is this upward trend just in the year 2017. So people that, natives, this is just natives. Natives that reside in countries with more immigrants are happier. But this is a cross-section, right? This is, there are a lot of factors that we haven't looked at. So culture, for example, isn't being accounted for. This is just a raw relationship. So this is going to look at it over time. So across the top here, we've got two sections. We've got the immigrant population share in two country groups. So the older member states, the EU 15, and then the new member states which joined later. And then on the bottom, you have life satisfaction. So you can see the immigrant population share is almost doubled in the older EU member states, and the new member states also increased. And but life satisfaction somewhat flat, and in fact probably increasing here in the blue line in the last period of time. So that's 2010, 2017. Whereas in the new member states, it actually increased quite a bit. So if you were just looking at the correlations over time, which allows for us to kind of abstract from some of these fixed characteristics like language, geography, and culture maybe, we can look and see if there's a relationship. It doesn't look like there's much. But we want to look at the statistics in a more rigorous way. So what I'm doing is assuming that aggregate life satisfaction in a country depends on the immigrant share, a set of time-varying factors like GDP, for example, and also unobserved time factors that could be trends or individual shocks in a period of time. And I'm going to look at this relationship in first differences, which means I'm representing the, I'm looking at the variables and how they change from one period to the next over time within a country. So looking at the change in life satisfaction and how it relates to the change in the immigrant share over time. And I mentioned I use a technique to look at a causal method, which I will try to give an intuition for here. So if you think about immigration affects natives' well-being, that's really the question. But also your choice to immigrate to a country is partially going to be dependent upon the characteristics of that country, right? So if the United States is more welcoming, people might want to move here. Or if we have a better economic situation, people might want to move here, right? So you can imagine that the relationship goes in both directions in this case. So, but then when I have what I'm calling origin push factors, so factors characteristic of the origin country, you can think of conflict or perhaps negative economic environment that are going to cause people to move. And so what I'm going to do is identify or predict the immigration to a destination country based just on these origin push factors. And then it's a statistical technique, distributional variable approach, two-stage least squares, that can allow me to just identify this relationship, which we can assume, or which we can take as causal. The other thing that might be important are several characteristics of the destination country. So basically, I'm thinking of these as mediators or transition mechanisms, which I'll elaborate on as we move forward. So that will be also kind of the structure of the talk. So let's go right to the results. Forgive me for the tables. I didn't think of a better way to present this, but they are quite simple. So here I've got basically three samples, the full sample, the EU 15 to the new member states across the top. You can see the number of countries. So I've got 24, 15, and 9. Although there are 28 countries in the EU right now, 4 were removed, which I don't have time to discuss at the moment. So this is the dependent variable is the change in life satisfaction, and it's related to the change in immigrant share. So the thing to note here are in brackets. This is the p-value, which I had to do for statistical purposes. It's essentially the probability that that number above it equals 0. So the probability that the number equals 0 is at least 20% in all of these regressions. Effectively, this is saying that there is no statistically identified impact of changing immigrant shares on the life satisfaction of natives. So no impact from the year 1990 to 2017. And then if you want to think about, so part of the limitation here is that it is a small number of observations, small number of countries. And so you might want to just think of the size of the impacts or the direction. So if you look at the EU 15, it is a positive, although imprecisely measured estimate, and then the new member states is negative, which I'll come to shortly. So what goes right in the abstract, there's no impact of changing immigrant shares on natives' life satisfaction over this time period for the full sample. No statistically identified. So immigration has no significant effect on life satisfaction of natives, just summarizing. But I did mention at the beginning that immigration is theorized to have both positive and negative effects that could operate through different channels. And perhaps these channels just offset each other. That's the reason why we didn't pick anything up. So what I'm going to do is do the same type of analysis, but instead of looking at life satisfaction as the outcome, I'm going to look at a whole bunch of other variables as potential outcomes. So here I've got all those variables along the left, and then along the right, there are two kind of panels here vertically. So the bottom panel are just variables that don't have the same amount of data on. So the top one, that's the change in the log of GDP per capita. Just think of that as GDP. Change in the population is immediately below the female population ratio, trade. You can kind of see what these are listed as. So here, you can see just the direction of the impact if it's statistically significant. So in the EU 15, increasing immigrants has a positive impact on GDP, has a positive impact on the total population, which seems to make sense. A negative impact on the female population ratio, meaning more men are moving, right? So most of these results are fairly intuitive, and note here, no impact on homicides at the bottom. It's not significant. That's what the NS stands for. The Gini goes up, income inequality goes up. So they may be not all positive impacts. However, the results are quite a bit different in the EU 15. If you highlight just these here, so starting in the bottom right, the working age population, population 15 to 64, increases with an increase in the number of immigrants, right? And so you get an increase in the number of people probably looking for jobs. Unemployment rate goes up, right? Suggesting that there's competition between these groups. And then the GDP per capita goes down. So it seems to be that in these cases that immigrants are operating as substitutes, but not true in the EU 15. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker here. So what I've done is basically I've added in those variables, the ones that are statistically significant. I'm just focusing on the new member states for the moment because there's more interest there. And what I've done is I've basically added in kind of the kitchen sink, and then I'm removing variables that are not important. It's kind of this general to specific approach. So what I've highlighted in that are kind of bold, so if you just move all the way to the right here, column 3 and column 4. Column 4 is the most interesting. If you just control for GDP per capita, the impact of immigration is now positive, right? So I showed you before the transition mechanisms. It seems like immigrants are substitutes. If we account for that with, so here, basically, all right, it's a little bit nuanced. Immigration negatively affects GDP, but GDP is positively related to life satisfaction. So if we separate that out, so by controlling for it, the remainder of the effect is positive and significant. So the way to interpret this is the non-economic impacts of immigrants in these countries is positive. But there is a negative channel also operating through GDP. So I've got to speed up a little bit, and this kind of helps support some of the relationships. The total effect size is not that large, but we can come to it in questions if there's time. So I have some additional results. We'll skip them. Also some heterogeneity by population group. So you might think of this as affecting different groups of people depending on where they are in the labor market. So by education and age. So in general, the EU 15, there's not a lot of significant differences. And in the new member states, the results are not what you'd expect. So you can kind of just move down all the way to the bottom here. So the Controlling for GDP, that's what we just looked at before. Actually, the low education, the above 50 groups are the ones that actually have improvements. So that's actually not what we would expect, because we expect the low educated people to be the ones competing. So a little bit of an unexpected result that I need to explore a little further. So those are those results. Skip that. So the conclusion is, coming back, you saw this at the beginning, people seem to be concerned. However, immigration does not have a statistically significant aggregate effect on natives' life satisfaction in general. And it was only in these new member states that we saw a negative mechanism through GDP, but a positive one also offsetting it coming from, let's say, non-economic impacts. So the conclusion is, in the EU15, the effects are not significant, both before and after accounting for transition mechanisms such as GDP per capita and population subgroups. The new member states, the evidence is consistent with the view that immigrants are substitutes in the labor market, but once the negative effects operating through GDP per capita are accounted for, the remaining are in fact positive. So if the economic impacts of the new member states could be mitigated, then the aggregate effects would actually be positive.
So our next speaker is my very talented colleague, Mona Ahmadiani. Mona is a research associate at the Eudaimonia Institute. She studies the economics of happiness and also works on environmental economics and applied econometrics. She's also working on a very interesting and important project trying to use the tools of economics to measure happiness. Thank you, Mona. Please join me in welcoming Mona Ahmadiani.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and this is a great pleasure to be among all these scholars. I feel a little bit overwhelmed by all the science of culture that's going on here, but I will rely on my economic knowledge a little bit here. So this is a joint work with my colleague Adam Hyde. In this study, we're trying to see the overlap between culture and geography of unobserved heterogeneity in subject. Today I'm going to show you a snapshot of the broad research, which we are going to investigate more in the future. And we are introducing a methodological approach that can be useful in other contexts too. So I encourage you all a common finding in the studies of subjective well-being is that there is a geography of happiness. It means that subjective well-being is varying across the space. These spatial variation in subjective well-being can be linked to different aspects, including physical, political, social, cultural, economic environments that the individual lives in. In this study, as I mentioned before, we are looking for systematic, unexplained variation. Which has been missed in previous studies. And specifically related to this conference, we're trying to focus on culture to be able to meet these needs. To give you a little bit of the literature review, this is a list of some of the studies that look at the spatial variation in subjective well-being. You can see in this list that there are some studies for the United States that look at different geographies of states, counties, rural, urban. There are also studies in different countries, including Canada, Germany, Ireland, and also there are many studies that are across countries, which Heliville is only one of them, and you can find many of them. But a question is that how these studies look at the culture and the cultural determinants of subjective well-being. A very common and widely used method is to equate cross-country analysis to cross-cultural analysis. We would say EU people, people of Germany, Iranian people, like people of the United States. But there are also other studies that look at the cultural determinants of different locations, like just focus on the differences in language or religion or political belief of different people and say these are cultural determinants. And sometimes in the conclusion or in the discussion, they get to the point and the conclusion that these are very, very highly linked to the geography of the boundaries of each country. So we built our analysis on two culture theories. The first one I got it from the book by Wiener, Subjective Well-being and Culture, 2009, which, regardless of the specific elements, all of the cultures enjoy an identical level of subjective well-being. Why we rely on this like statement? Because we don't want to have any prejudgment about the impact of culture. We want to investigate and see if everyone have similar subjective well-being with different culture. There are some evidence that richest Americans are experiencing the same subjective well-being as Pennsylvania Amish or Inuit in Greenland. We'll also investigate the cultural homogeneity. As you all know, better than me, the cultural homogeneity is the degree to which people in a society share the same culture and belief. So talking about subjective well-being, the main important thing is that how culture enter into subjective well-being measures. We have different response styles. So like for example, there are these studies that shows Japanese people, they are more likely to give a moderate response compared to other people in Western countries. But also culture into our measure of subjective well-being when we have a different interpretation of the value in our life. Like for example, religious people may have a different view on suffering compared to other people. So they may even enjoy suffer at some point and they translate it into something flourishing. So talking about all these, inputs, an empirical solution to be able to study these differences is a method we call fixed effect. Usually in econometric, we use just one parameter that represents each culture. But there is a problem in using fixed effect because this method is prone to just not taking into account the intra-boundary differences in culture. So because I don't want to keep you until the end of the presentation to give you the interesting result, this is a summary of results which we find that in the United States, there is a significant variation in subjective well-being. This significant variation is also true when we are looking at different NSA within a state, and we have very large variation for some of these NSAs. We reject the hypothesis that there is no systematic link between culture and geographical heterogeneity. And we would say that yes, culture variables, but culture matters. And we also, would like to make this claim that we should be more cautious about using fixed effect as a method to control for cultural differences in subjective well-being. In this study, we used two variables that identify culture. One of them is religion. The other one is political party. We find that religious of any faith increase satisfaction with life. Compared to group of no religion, atheist or agnostic people, all faiths of Christianity are negatively affected by living in more diverse locations. And our studies in the United States. Because we investigate the measure of cultural homogeneity, we also find that individual subjective well-being increase when their culture or their religion is representation of their own. Individual subjective well-being increases as representation of their own religious belief increases in their NSA. We find that Democrats are happier than Republicans, while independents and members of other parties are not as happy as Republicans. And compared to Republicans, Democrats gains a higher satisfaction that they are living in a diverse location. This is our empirical model. It is a random effect model, which the difference between this model and previous model that have fixed effect is that they have a distribution for these states and NSA fixed effect. And subjective well-being here is subjective well-being of individual I at location J at state K, and we are controlling for all individual characteristics. So there is no individual effect of subjective well-being when we are looking at the NSA and state. So our study also is multi-level regression because we have different levels. We believe that individuals living in the same MSA, sharing some you know, similar subjective well-being, and individuals living in different MSAs of the same state are sharing the same subjective well-being. So these are this shows that individuals are the individual subjective well-being is varying about a mean subjective well-being of MSA, and MSA subjective well-being, which here is presented in green distribution, are varying about state subjective well-being. We use Gallup US Daily, which is the data from 2007 to 2018, 17, and there is a question in Gallup US Daily that asks, imagine that your life is a ladder. At what step of a ladder you would say your life is, you stand? From the best possible life to the worst possible life. And it can be from 0 to 10. We use Simpson's Diversity Index, which also equivalent to HHI index in industrial organization to measure the diversity of religion and political party. Also, we have a measure of belongingness, which is a percentage of individuals' religion and political orientation in their MSA. We standardize these numbers relative to the mean and the variation of religion and political party in the United States. This is a graphical presentation of our result. You see that this is the rank of states. This might be a little bit small, but I'm going to zoom in. This is the rank of states, the subjective well-being of different states. First 4 states, the larger numbers are Texas, North Dakota, Hawaii, and Arkansas. And last 2 is New Jersey and Nevada. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these numbers, which might not be very, to you may not seem very large, living in New Jersey is just like being divorced in terms of the subjective in terms of the subjective well-being studies. So just be careful. And this variation shows that it is very important to identify what is inside, what can explain this variation. These can be because of different location determinants. We also present this result, this is the same graph, but we show it in a regional basis, and you can see that Northeast, most of the states in Northeast area, they are unhappy, and most of the states in South are happy. So you can find your states if you're interested, and we can talk about it later. As I mentioned before, as I show you the model, we also have the MSAs within each state. Why it is important? Because there are lots of subjective well-being inequality in different states. There might be metropolitan statistical areas that are very happy, but at the same time, there might be some other areas that are not enjoying a very happy life. So this is, again, a graphical presentation of the MSAs within each state, but it's graphed for each state. If we overlay these 2 graphs, we can see that there are some states like Texas, some states like Georgia, that they have a positive state subjective well-being, but their average within a state subjective well-being is negative. So what drives this result? This can be either one metropolitan statistical area which is very, very unhappy, or a bunch of statistical areas that are all unhappy. So this can be a very important question for a local decision maker, that why there are some locations in that states that are not enjoying the same subjective well-being. We also have other states like Arizona that also, although it is very negative, but you can see that there is not that much variation in that states. So because we are looking at distribution of the subjective well-being, we can use the variance and see, yes, that's true, the subjective well-being is different in different locations, but how dispersed is this variation? You can see the graph of dispersion here, and one very interesting thing that actually this is my takeaway from this graph is that states like Texas and Georgia that I just showed you that they have negative state subjective well-being or positive within a state subjective well-being, the variation for them is low. So if you look at this part of the graph, you will see that there is not a large variation. So most of the people living in these states are unhappy. It is unhappy, but it's not because they're one unhappy, it's because there are many unhappy. So these are all need further investigation. I mean, making link to different aspects, but this modeling, because it is a random effect model, it takes into account lots of unobserved heterogeneity. So that's the point of using this model. Our variable of interest here is religion and political orientation. As I mentioned before, as you can see, these stars shows that we have a statistically significant result. And all faiths of Christianity, they are all happier than other people in our sample. Actually, I would say life. This is a life evaluation question, so they are more satisfied with their life. To be able to investigate the impact of cultural differences on these unobserved heterogeneity, geographic unobserved heterogeneity, we add different measures of cultural homogeneity or belongingness one at a time. So as you see in the first column, we don't have any of those variables of diversity or belongingness. But in the second column, we include diversity and belongingness and we interact them with different religion. And we find that Christian people doesn't like diversity. Yeah, I mean, this is what data shows. We let data speak for us. But any comments or any ideas is very, very welcome. We show that religious belongingness has a positive effect. So people prefer to live in a location that they belong. So it's kind of a positive emotion or the gratification of higher needs. And this is when we include the political orientation variable. The first column is just the variable itself. The second column includes the diversity. And the third column, we include the interaction between political belongingness and political party, because we find that there is a negative effect for political belongingness. And we understand that this negative effect is driven by Democrats. So they prefer to be in places that they don't belong. So this is something very puzzling to us too, but we appreciate any comments or any ideas on that. Yes, please. Yes, the data is from 2008 to 2017. And it's collected by 2008 to 2017. But control for time, control for all individual characteristics, control for Gini inequality, and also take into account unobserved heterogeneity at geographical level, which might be because of different macroeconomic or state policy or different things. After controlling for all of these cultural elements and determinants of subjective well-being, we find that the dispersion of these spatial variation has decreased. So you can see in the first box plot up here, this is the result of those bar chart that I showed you, and this is the result of a model that includes our political and religion variable. And you can see that the median has increased, so people are more happier, and we have fewer of those very negative states or MSAs in our sample. And also we have an outlier, which we investigate. So as I mentioned, this is a method which we are going to investigate more research with them. The first one is that we're going to use eudaimonic and hedonic measures of subjective well-being and couple these different measures with our current studies. We are going to revisit the research hypothesis with regard to measures of intensity of religion. So when people say they associate themselves with a religion, they might not really be a religious person. So that might be one of the things that we really need to look at, and also the political orientation. We will look at rural versus urban area to be able to answer more questions. And in the future, we plan to use board pool, Gallup board pool, to be able to compare different countries. And at the end, we would like to investigate other distributions, not just normal distribution. And we think that this is a very interesting and important research question because it will, give some policy. It can answer some local policymakers, and we can identify areas with very low or very high subjective well-being and link those to culture and cultural differences, and be able to answer those differences. And at the end, we can lessen the regional subjective well-being inequality. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker is Christopher Jacoby from the University of Oxford. Christopher is a final year doctoral student in sociology. He's also spent time at the University of Pennsylvania as well. And the title of his paper is Trends in Religiousness and Positive Mental Health in the United Kingdom. Please join me in welcoming Christopher.
Thank you for the welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here because 4 years ago I picked eudaimonia as the theme of my doctoral research. And 4 years ago, no one knew what this is all about. And so to see an institute where there's momentum and energy, that's quite amazing. So thank you for your leadership and for your free success, Jim. It's really great. And all the best in the future as well. So I'll be talking about eudaimonia and religion. I've got a long title, but let's stick with the small one, eudaimonia and religion. So what do we think? Is this man happy? He doesn't seem to be extremely joyous or overly, he doesn't dance around the place, but people do say that religion makes people happy. Why is he happy? Does he have to be a Catholic, an Anglican? Does it matter which religion he belongs to? These are questions I'm going to explore. And so far, there is actually a big literature on this topic, and there's a stylized fact, I would say, that religious people are across the board, and when controlling for many factors, they're found to be happier than the non-religious. But I'm going to extend this literature, and I'm going to, for the first time, I think, use a comprehensive measure of eudaimonia, and I'm going to be looking at large-scale and timely longitudinal data, and this is all in the United Kingdom. So my research question is religiosity positively associated with eudaimonia? And when I say positively, it's because we think it should be, but of course the statistics allow for negative association as well. So what do we mean by eudaimonia? Here I present a graphical topic map of a web search for the terms, it's a Boolean of eudai and relig. And so this is what the internet thinks, like the top 100 search results, including the following links within these results. And I think it roughly confirms what we think about as well when we talk about eudaimonia. So on the bottom left, we have topics like virtue, ethics, humans, so living a responsible and flourishing life. And on the top right, we have the alternative school of thought, which is about happiness and achievement. So we've got these kind of two broad trends in eudaimonia. And when I say eudaimonia, I also want to clarify that I'm linking this to religion via the concept of positive mental health and positive psychology, because that's really, I mean, for better or worse, that's where the literature is at the moment. It's really the positive psychology school of thought that has pushed the topic of eudaimonia, which is a philosophical topic, forward. So why should religiosity and eudaimonia be linked? There are studies that found that, obviously, religious people can find meaning in their faith. They have a sense of optimism because God created the world, because he loved us and he wants us to be happy and successful. And obviously that gives people hope and joy. There's also self-knowledge, because the world is intelligible. So if we reflect and contemplate, we can gain knowledge about ourselves, about the Bible teaches us how to behave in moral dilemmas. There are also psychological consequences in the way that religious people are more forgiving, and they have a sense of gratitude for what's been given to them in their life, even if they're in difficult situations. And there's some evidence that religious people tend to be more calm, and they strive for harmony rather than strong conflict. And then lastly, there's an argument that religious people, that prayer has a positive effect on mental health because it's calming, the body responds very positively to praying, meditation, and contemplation. So these are like individual studies that have been getting close towards eudaimonia, but they've only been looking at one side of eudaimonia. And what I'm presenting to you here is the conceptual link between religiosity and positive mental health, or eudaimonia, if you wish. So meaning in life in terms of religion can be linked to intrinsic motivation. And that's the key argument in psychology when we come to eudaimonia. It's Barbara Fredrickson. She's actually based at the University of North Carolina. She talks about intrinsic motivation, that when people have meaning in their life and hope that they can, out of their own choosing, out of their own freedom, they can broaden and build their positive emotions, they can learn, they can grow. And so that's linked to meaning in life. There's optimism. That's Martin Seligman's big argument about positive psychology when he founded it. And there's really it's a great topic that you picked for the conference because it overlaps so strongly with the positive psychology school of thought. There's self-knowledge, so personal growth, self-actualization when we talk about Maslow, so the pyramid of needs. There's forgiveness, again, Martin Seligman, you got the values in action survey and character strength. And there's evidence of gratefulness intervention. So Martin Seligman, he would now pause and make each other, hug each other and say something nice, and that's like his takeaway message. And there are so many studies that show that meditation has positive effects on mental well-being across the board. Yep. There's also another indirect benefit of religiosity, and that's the one of that religion can be seen as a cure to depression. Some people go as far as saying we should make people religious when they suffer from depression because that's better than any medicine we have. Though that's depression, so that's negative mental health. It's quite distinct from eudaimonia, but the argument is the same. And there are associated indirect benefits of religiosity, such as communal and social activities, especially among older people, because religion is a form of, it's a group, you see each other every week, and you do good activities, fun things. There's connectedness with others because you share in that emotion of transcendence, and you pray together, and that can be quite powerful. There's volunteering, obviously. There's also health behavior, because if you think that your body is a temple of thought, then you should probably behave a little bit more responsible than if you think it doesn't matter. And there's also the benefit of dealing with challenges in life. So really, there's a very strong overlap with why eudaimonia should be especially positively linked with religiosity. And then, of course, why is this relevant for understanding eudaimonia? Because the majority of the world's population is religious. Religion and spirituality used to represent, and I say used to because that's maybe nowadays in doubt, foundational cultural experiences and values. And also, religiosity can be used to then explain what it is about eudaimonia that causes all these benefits. So I've got 4 hypotheses that we're going to find out about. The first one is that an increase or higher religiosity causes higher eudaimonic well-being. The second one is that eudaimonia corresponds better than other mental health scales because of the conceptual links that I've outlined, and that there is no difference between churches, because a priori, why should we believe that one church is better than the other in terms of creating eudaimonia? But we can find, I'd be happy to talk about it, but I think a priori there's no evidence to say at this stage that there are big differences. And there are significant within-person effects. So by within-person, I mean longitudinal analysis within a person, getting closer towards a robust analysis, rather than just cross-sectional evidence. So in terms of methods, I'm using Understanding Society. It's actually the world's largest household panel survey. There are 7 waves of data. I don't look at all 7 waves all the time, but at one point I do. And then the key advantage of this data set is that it has rich mental health measures. So the eudaimonic scale that I'm talking about is the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. It's considered to be the gold standard of psychological eudaimonic well-being. I'm going to go into detail later. And then I have a scale for negative mental health. It's a GHQ, life satisfaction as it's commonly used, and the short form health survey. And a control for a whole range of variables that could influence the relationship between religiosity and eudaimonia, such as age, gender, marital status, education, employment status, health status, and also all 5 psychological traits, because obviously one's psychological makeup could influence the likelihood to be religious or the way you interpret being religious, and then the effect of mental health. So this is the Warwick-Edinburgh scale. So this is the measure of eudaimonia that we're talking about. So 7 items, each scored from 1 to 5. So already you can see it's a big scale, and so it goes further than life satisfaction, where usually people cluster around 7 or only among 5 response categories. Not all of the items are eudaimonic. It also includes hedonic variables. It's been quite it's been tested in this way, though, and it's been created in the sense of capturing eudaimonia. So optimism, dealing with problems well, all of these are psychological concepts that show of a eudaimonic character, where you're dealing with problems successfully, and also feeling useful and being close to other people, because social well-being in psychology is often seen in a related way to eudaimonia. So it includes eudaimonic aspects, psychological functioning, and also hedonia. All items are positively worded, and that's important, because if you want to get a positive concept, which is eudaimonia, and you have negatively worded items, then there are a whole range of psychometric consequences, because people respond differently to positive and negatively worded questions. There are no ceiling effects, which means that you can capture the entire range of well-being, rather than just being limited to middle values, and also no flooring effects. So it's got a very positive distribution. It's been translated into 25 languages and ethnic groups and all of that. So here's the distribution of the scale. And as you can see in blue, there's a normal distribution, and then for man and woman, and it's a very almost normally distributed scale, going from 7 to 35. So really we can capture a broad array of well-being. I've got 2 measures of religiosity. The first one is religiosity in terms of importance. So the question is, does religion make a difference to your life? And scored from no difference to a great difference. And here you see the distributions. You'd be shocked as Americans, because in the UK people are not that religious. So the majority of people actually respond they're not religious. And the dot represents missing data, but there's not that much missing data, in case you're wondering. Women tend to be slightly more religious in the sense of that. My second indicator is religiosity in terms of attendance. And there it asks how often you go to religious services. So I can capture both the importance of religion and when you pay a price and you actually go to church on a Sunday. So we've got both of those. And very similar distribution. Actually, it's people are less religious on this scale, because actually going to church is harder than just saying religion matters. I use a whole array of psychometric and econometric techniques. I will introduce them while we see the results. I look at interaction effects and also at fixed effects and some more modern techniques as well. So yeah, first hypothesis. Religiosity, does it positively influence eudaimonia? I'm happy to report that it does. Here we see both indicators. On the top is religiosity in terms of importance, and we almost see a linear increase that from no difference to great difference. We see in total a 1-point increase on the Warwick-Edinburgh scale of eudaimonia. And because it's so linear, we have quite good, we have strong confidence that really every step in religiosity has a positive influence on well-being. And on the bottom, we have the attendance scale, and the overall association is similar. Also, the effect size is similar, but for the middle categories, infrequent and once a month, there's no linear increase. So maybe it's about the question wording, like what does infrequent mean? Maybe it means different things to different people. Here I show the distribution of well-being and age groups and religiosity in terms of importance. And you can see that older people tend to be happier. They have more eudaimonic well-being. But at almost every step in the distribution of age, people who are very religious tend to be happier or have more eudaimonia than people who are not religious. So across the age board. So that's an interaction effect I looked at there. And it's quite consistent, so it gives us confidence in the results. Here I look at gender differences, and gender differences are quite small. So the effect between men and women on religiosity and in terms of importance is not that important. For attendance, we do see an effect that women who are either never attending religious services have a lower effect, and women who have a very high attendance rate have a small positive boost. So maybe in terms of, maybe it's a social dimension of going to churches, or some of the specific scales of actually attending church. We can talk about it later. I'm just going through a whole array of variables to paint a picture that no matter what we look at, there's a robust association with eudaimonia. So here we're looking at education, and again we see that religiosity in terms of attendance, like the more you attend, the better it is for your health, and it's across the board. And we also see that people who are more educated tend to report higher eudaimonic well-being. There's a bit of an outlier when it comes to other qualifications, so it's people who don't score too well on education. I'm not sure, it might be an outlier in the data. I want to be cautious. Maybe it's about the kind of jobs they have. I don't know. We have to find out more later. Here I look at psychological traits, agreeableness, for instance, and we see that the more agreeableness people report, that the higher their mental well-being is, and religiosity again has a positive effect across the board. Same for openness. For neuroticism, which obviously is a negative psychological trait, we see the opposite relation, but the same kind of effect size, that more religious people respond more positively across the board of that psychological concept. There are two others, but I'm not showing them now for time purposes. Okay, so hypothesis one confirmed. Eudaimonia has a very strong relationship with religiosity. And actually, 1 point increase is considered to be a clinically relevant increase because this scale comes from the clinical literature as well. So my second hypothesis is that eudaimonia is better in the sense that it's more responsive to religiosity compared to other mental health scales. Actually, we see it confirmed. So in blue, we have the Warwick eudaimonia scale, and we see that as religiosity increases towards, for people where religion makes a great difference, these people respond higher well-being, and that's higher than life satisfaction, which is actually flat, or yeah, it's flat essentially. And for GHQ, which is negative mental health, we see a small increase. But it's really the eudaimonic scale that corresponds to religiosity. It's not the negative mental health or life satisfaction scales. Here I have the alternative measure of religion, which is attendance. And even though the overall trend is the same, the confidence intervals overlap a bit more. So one of the findings as well is that attendance of religious services in this data set is not a good measure as a psychological importance one, maybe because it's more related to eudaimonia from a psychological perspective. I'm presenting a factor analysis here of the Warwick-Edinburgh scale because it could be that within that scale, the eudaimonic questions are more relevant than the hedonic ones. And even though overall mental health is a one-factor solution, if we push the techniques, we can do it on 2 factors just to explore it. And we see that optimism and usefulness cluster together. So that seems to be one factor that corresponds to religion. And on the other side, we have maybe more psychological functioning ones, like dealing with problems well and thinking clearly. So it's another dimension where we see a difference in how religion has a positive effect, but a slightly differential positive effect. And social well-being is also quite interesting that it's in between these 2 factors. So social well-being seems to matter as well. I'm showing similar things here for religiosity of the subscales, and we see that feeling useful and feeling optimistic show the strongest effect, so that the higher your religiosity on these scales, the better your effect of well-being is. So they're the most responsive. And it's a similar situation for religious attendance. This one is quite an important one. So here the argument is that religiosity should matter both at the low end and the top end of well-being. So people who are depressed, maybe religion takes them out of their depression. And people who are doing already well, maybe it gives them a boosting effect. That's a key concept in psychology, of a boosting effect. And interestingly, what we see confirmed is that there's only a boosting effect. There's no buffering effect of religiosity on well-being. So if you look at the bottom area here, there's a strong effect. There's a strong effect for the highest level of religiosity. And again, a linear increase. Hypothesis 3 was that there's no difference between churches. So these are the churches that are common in England. I mean, most people don't belong to a church. And then Anglicans, Catholics, and so on. And we see that the reference group is non-believers. And compared to non-believers, which are not shown in this graph, Anglicans, for instance, the first one, they have an increase in eudaimonic well-being. So that's, I think the Christian effect is very similar to what Nona reported and previously. And I think you also had a negative effect for Muslims. And interestingly, I also have a negative effect for Muslims when it comes to religion and the effect of well-being. So that's an overlap that's, I think, quite nice to see. And then I kind of validate this on all the scales of well-being, so not just eudaimonia, but also negative mental health and life satisfaction. And the same trend is confirmed, but we also see that Sikhs, I think you pronounce them, they have a very negative effect on life satisfaction. But that might be biased by the low numbers that I have, because obviously with so many religions, the sample size goes down a bit. So I wouldn't overinterpret, but I think given the confidence intervals, 95%, overall it's an important effect. And then finally, hypothesis 4 is significant within-person effect of religiosity. So here I'm doing a longitudinal panel data analysis. I'm using modern methods, which is called hybrid effect. It combines fixed and random effects. So it's, again, quite similar to what was done in the previous talk. And you can see, for instance, for importance, so the red ones, you see that W stands for within and B stands for between. So we see that it's both within and between effect. So this is evidence that it's not just a cross-sectional effect of religion on, it's not just for other reasons that people are religious and therefore they are also happier, but that there's true change, that as people become more religious over time, they see an effect on their well-being. And interestingly, for attendance, we don't see that within effect of religiosity on well-being. So yeah, it's probably something about the scale, or we would have to do more research to find out. But it's interesting to see the difference between the two. So to sum up, hypothesis 1 was confirmed. Religiosity is associated with eudaimonia, and that was all while controlling for the covariates. And interestingly, it matters at the top level. So religion gives you a boost at the top level. When you're already doing quite well in terms of well-being, you get an additional boost from being religious. It's not actually a cure to depression, as we've seen before. Hypothesis 2 is that there's a distinct association, and we've seen that eudaimonia is actually more responsive to religiosity than the competing mental health scales. I didn't predict the differences between churches, but there were differences among Muslims who were lower. And hypothesis 4 is significant within variation. So that gives us confidence that it's a true change effect over time. In terms of future research, obviously we should be looking at different contexts, different countries, and different time effects. Measurement is always a big problem with these subjective scales because there's so much measurement variance and subjectivity in the scales. I tried to do my best with the psychometric methods that I reported, but obviously measurement is a big problem. We could be looking at more objective indicators, I think. We could be asking different people about what do they think, how eudaimonally happy are you, for instance, or some more objective data, like third-person validation could be interesting. And then causalities, of course, it could be the case that happier people become religious, but I think because I've tackled this question from so many angles, different scales, different levels, different control variables, different psychological traits, and across the board, I found that strong effect. I think it's evidence to say that it's not causal evidence as such, but I think it's strong evidence nonetheless that it's really religiosity that has an impact on eudaimonic well-being. So I'm happy to conclude that religiosity does have a positive effect, and be very interested in your questions, and thanks again for inviting me.